Hi everyone, welcome to video number 4 in our series on Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. We are going to wrap up the series on these three young gentlemen today as we look at the lessons we can grow by or how we can grow in our spiritual life toward God. If you haven't watched the other 3 videos, I encourage you to go back and watch video 1, 2, and 3 of the life of these 3 young men and see how we can learn about their significance, their challenges, and lessons they can teach us. But today we're going to be looking at how we can grow closer to God based on what we learn in their story. Their story is found in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel chapter 2, and Daniel chapter 3. We see them mentioned in the Bible. And so we want to, as we look at these verses, as you read these chapters, we want to see how can you and I in today's world grow closer to God based on what we learn from their life that happened thousands of years ago. And so there's some very important things that we can see that we can still apply to our lives today. Every story in the Bible is there for a reason, and this is just another example of this extraordinary story that many people would think, oh, it couldn't have happened, it's not true. How can people be thrown into a fiery furnace and not come out even smelling like smoke? How can this happen? But this is an example of God's miraculous work, but it's also an example of how even this amazing event that happened to these young men, it can help us learn how to make it through our lives today and how to serve God in our lives today. And so we want to see a few things that we can continue to learn and grow closer to God. The first thing we want to look at in this is that we must make sure that God is our source of growth. Well, what does that mean? That means that we make sure that our growth, spiritual growth, our growth toward getting to know God better comes from God, not coming from the world, not coming from men, not coming from other places, but coming from God. In chapter 1, we see these 3 young men, we see them go and they wanted to do what they knew was right in the eyes of God. They wanted to keep the diet that God had put them on and that they believed was right, and so they continued to follow Him. He was their source. They were confident that if they did what God wanted them to do, they would be blessed. And because of this blessing that God put upon them, we see them continue to be promoted and blessed throughout the story of their life. But they relied on God to be their source of growth. You and I must rely on God each and every day to be our source of growth. We want to know God better, spend more time with God. We want to know Him better, spend time in His Word. We want to draw closer to Him, spend time in prayer with Him. Every day, make Him your source of growth. Don't rely on man. Don't trust in man, but trust in God to help you grow. They were willing to sacrifice for God. They were willing to sacrifice for God. There are 3 sacrifices that we see that they made here. First of all was their servitude to the king, Nebuchadnezzar, in chapter 1. And they did this, that they sacrificed by serving him, but also they sacrificed by saying, we don't want to do what the king wants us to do. We want to do what God wants us to do with this diet that they had in chapter 1. The second thing we see is they sacrificed their life positions, these positions of power they had, by not bowing down. They were willing to sacrifice their status in the world. How many of us are willing to sacrifice our job? How many of us are willing to sacrifice our family status or just being with our family? Some people, when they accept Jesus Christ, their family disowns them. Their family will not have anything to do with them. How many of us are willing to make that type of sacrifice? These 3 young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we see them not just sacrificing to a servitude to a king that doesn't serve their God, but they were willing to sacrifice their positions in the kingdom, their positions of power, everything they had, to not bow down to the king and continue doing what they were supposed to be doing. And finally, they went to the point to where they were willing to sacrifice their life. They sacrificed their life by denying the king and the worship that he wanted them to do and worshiping the one true God. We must learn that as we grow closer to God, we're going to be required to sacrifice more and more of our life. It may sound scary, but know that the outcome is always more than worth the sacrifice that we make for God. We must also learn to overcome obstacles. As we draw closer to God, we're going to have more sacrifice. We're going to have more obstacles that get in our way. And these 3 had obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. But what did they do? They relied on God every step of the way. They relied on Him. They never gave up. They never lost their faith, and they trusted that God would take care of them. And as they did that, they didn't just trust that God would take care of them. They had set expectations. And here's what I mean by that. I believe that one of the problems in Christians' lives is that our expectations don't match up with God's expectations. And so we see in our life that our expectations are these great and grand things. And then God comes in and says, my expectations are for you to do this over here. And it doesn't match with what we want. And so a lot of times people will stop serving God. They'll lose their faith, their trust in God, because their expectations are over here and God's expectations for us are over here. These three gentlemen set their expectations. Their expectations were this: God will take care of us no matter where we're at as long as we serve Him. God will deliver us. We will not bow down to other gods. And even if He doesn't deliver us, we will remain faithful and let God take care of the rest. Those were their expectations. They didn't brag, they didn't boast, but they stood strong in the Lord, and they said, our expectations are God's expectations. So, we can learn to grow closer to God by looking at these three gentlemen. We saw some lessons in video 3 that we can learn. But if we had to narrow all this down to one main point, what's the one thing we can learn from them? There's so many lessons we can learn, but what is one main point? Well, in my opinion, one of the main points that I would like for everyone to learn is this: when our faith is tested, keep relying on God. When our faith is tested, keep relying on God. As you go through your Christian life, your faith is going to be tested each and every day. And instead of running away from the obstacles, from running away from the sacrifices, instead of running away from the trouble that comes when the world stands up against you, rely on God. Keep your faith in God. Let your expectations be His expectations for your life. Trust in Him in everything that you have, and see how God will not only bless you, but bless those around you. These three young gentlemen give us such an amazing story. And as we watched these, as we went through these videos, we just barely touched on everything we can learn from them. So I encourage you to continue reading about these three men in Daniel chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3, and see where God leads you, and see what God is trying to teach you about these great men of faith. These men that relied on God in every instance, in every obstacle that came up. They kept their faith in God, and because of that, they turned a nation that wasn't serving God around, and a nation that began to see the benefits of serving the one true God.